Have you ever wondered where our ideas about government come from? Have you ever wondered where Thomas Jefferson got those great ideas about equality and the rights of man from? What about his ideas about the purpose of government? Government being run by the people, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Of all the ideas that became the United States, there's a line here that's at the heart of all the others. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government. People don't talk that way anymore.
Beautiful. Huh. No idea what you said.
Books. Glorious books.
Take a look, it's in a book, a reading rainbow.
Authors like Aristotle, Plato, and the European philosophers from the Enlightenment period. John Locke, Montesquieu, Voltaire, Jean-Jacques Rousseau.
I am French.
Thomas Hobbes. The Enlightenment, which is what we're going to break down right now. Enlightenment was a period of history in the 1700s where various scholars and philosophers wrote books expressing their ideas and their theories on religion, the rights of man, government. They began to shift public opinion, shifting them from an acceptance of an absolute monarch and the old feudal system to more democratic forms of government based on the will of the people, based on protecting people's rights, based on democracy and liberty. They changed the way people thought about government. Let's head to the big board and look at some primary sources and see what these guys had to say.
The big board.
But though men, when they enter into society, give up the equality, liberty, and executive power they had in the state of nature into the hands of the society to be so far disposed of by the legislative as the good of the society shall require, yet it being only with an intention in everyone the better to preserve himself, his liberty, and property. For no rational creature can be supposed to change his condition with an intention to be worse. The power of the society or legislative constituted by them can never be supposed to extend farther than the common good, but is obliged to secure everyone's property by providing against those three defects above mentioned that made the state of nature so unsafe and uneasy.
So what's John Locke say here? Let's start with his idea of the state of nature. So if you think back to the beginning of time, John Locke is referring to this time in world history where man roamed the earth in more of a nomadic way of life. So in a state of nature, man is on his own. You had to protect your own life, your own liberty, your own property. Living in the state of nature was very dangerous. Locke says that it's unsafe and uneasy. Survival of the fittest. It was a very dangerous time. So eventually, man decides that it's much better to live under a set of laws and government. The government's designed to protect your life, your liberty, and your property. So there is this give and take. We call that the social contract. But what if it's the government that's threatening our life, our liberty, and our property? It's a good question. Why don't you let me know in the comments what you think?
But they'll never take our freedom!
Hereby it is manifest that during the time men live without a common power to keep them all in awe, they are in that condition which is called war. And such a war is of every man against every man. In such condition there is no place for industry, because the fruit thereof is uncertain, and consequently no culture of the earth, and which is worst of all continual fear and danger of violent death, and the life of man solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. For the laws of nature as justice, equity, modesty, mercy, and in some, going to others as we would be done to of themselves, without the terror of some power to cause them to be observed, are contrary to our natural passions, that carry us to partiality, pride, revenge, and the like. And covenants without the sword are but words, and of no strength to secure a man at all.
Hobbes has a pretty negative view of humanity. Hobbes is a big advocate of strong, powerful leaders. Hobbes thinks you should have a strong, powerful government, a government that can maintain control, because without control, there's no peace. Hobbes thinks that because of the state of nature, you would live in continual fear. Notice what he says here. He says, every man for himself, every man against every man. He says, when we live like this, every man for themselves, nothing gets accomplished, nothing good gets done. So you need a government to come in and maintain law and order for life to carry on.
I am your president of law and order.
So when someone's in charge, things can get done. You can have commerce, you can live your life because you know your property is going to be protected. He says that without governments, man lives a solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, short life.
Be quiet! I order you to be quiet!
Order? Who does he think he is?
I am your king!
Well, I didn't vote for you.
I'm a savage.
So look at that last line. And covenants without the sword are but words, and of no strength to secure a man at all. Covenants. What are covenants? So basically, well, covenant is a contract. Laws are no good without someone to back them up. So what happens if you break the law? You have to have a strong government to step in to enforce that law. If laws aren't enforced, then there's no protection, there's no safety.
Again, there is no liberty if the judiciary power be not separated from the legislative and executive. Were it joined with the legislative, the life and liberty of the subject would be exposed to arbitrary control, for the judge would be then the legislator. Were it joined to the executive power, the judge might behave with violence and oppression. Democratic and aristocratic states are not in their own nature free. Political liberty is to be found only in moderate governments, and even in these it is not always found. It is there only when there is no abuse of power, but constant experience shows us that every man invested with power is apt to abuse it.
Montesquieu's main concern was government and how to limit the power of government.
I am the Senate.
But how do you make sure that the government's power is not absolute? Let me ask you, how would you limit the power of government? How do you make sure that the government or members of the government don't abuse their power? How do you make sure judges don't accept bribes? How do you make sure that the president doesn't abuse his power? How do you make sure Congress doesn't pass bad laws? Montesquieu recognizes that there are three basic powers of government. 1, to legislate or to make laws. Number 2, executive power, which basically means to enforce laws. And 3, judicial power, which means to try cases. Montesquieu wanted to make sure that legislative, executive, and judicial powers were not in the hands of one person. Montesquieu thought you should have a separation of powers, a system of checks and balances, if you will. Montesquieu says power should be a check on power. Montesquieu knew that power could lead to corruption, but remember,
with great power comes great responsibility.
So you need 3 separate branches that have checks or limits on the other branch's power. We'll come back to this when we talk about the Constitution in a later episode.
But here follows a more essential difference between Rome and England, which gives the advantage entirely to the latter. That the civil wars of Rome ended in slavery and those of the English liberty. The English are the only people upon earth who have been able to prescribe limits to the power of kings by resisting them, and who by a series of struggles have at last established that wise government where the prince is all-powerful to do good and at the same time is restrained from committing evil, where the nobles are great without insolence, though there are no vassals, and where the people share in the government without confusion.
So here Voltaire is comparing Rome to England. Voltaire was kind of a critic. Voltaire liked to comment on the works of other people, like John Locke. He wasn't afraid to let them know what he thought.
Where's the lamb sauce?
So here Voltaire seemed to admire the English for how their government has developed, how they went from an absolute monarchy to more of a constitutional monarchy. Remember the Magna Carta in 1215?
The barons demanded that King John obey the law.
Back to Voltaire. So Voltaire's pretty impressed by how the English have watered down the monarchy, have reduced some of the power of the monarchy, and put some of the power into the hands of the people. He says that the prince, which is the king or the executive, is still powerful enough to do good, but is restrained by the people. In this case, the Parliament, which is the legislative body of England. So 2 thumbs up for England. And what about Rome? He's not very impressed with Rome.
Are you not entertained?
The problem is to find a form of association which will defend and protect with the whole common force the person and goods of each associate, and in which each, while uniting himself with all, may still obey himself alone and remain as free as before. This is the fundamental problem of which the social contract provides the solution. Finally, each man, in giving himself to all, gives himself to nobody. And as there is no associate over whom he does not acquire the same right as he yields others over himself, he gains an equivalent for everything he loses, and an increase of force for the preservation of what he had.
All right, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Rousseau's main idea here is the social contract. Think of a contract as an agreement. This isn't a formal agreement written down on paper. Remember, John Locke said man created government. So this is what he's talking about. So the social contract, basically it's an agreement between man and the government that we created. And like any contract, there's 2 sides. Our job is to obey the laws that the government creates. So what's the government's job? The government's job is to protect us. Remember, our life, our liberty, our property. And like any contract, if someone breaks the contract, then there's going to be penalties. For us, we get arrested or we go to jail. But what happens if the government breaks the contract? What happens then? Notice here that Rousseau says, while uniting himself with all. So he's talking about joining into a society, a community, under a system of laws. So this social contract isn't written down anywhere, but we understand it. But basically, we all agree that it's better to live under a system of laws than to live in a system where every man is on his own. But you do have to have a good government, which is what the revolution was about. If the government starts to abuse the people, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish that government. Each of us plays an important part in our society. We have to participate. We have to stay engaged. We have to vote. You are an indivisible part of this society. You matter. You matter. We need you. Time for the recap. All right, number 1. The Enlightenment was a period in the 1700s where European philosophers and scholars challenged people's concepts of government and power and human rights. Number 2. Some of the Enlightenment's most well-known authors are John Locke, Thomas Hobbes, Voltaire, Montesquieu, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And number 3, the Enlightenment played a major role in the creation of our constitutional democracy. Founding fathers like James Madison and Thomas Jefferson used the ideas from the Enlightenment as they were building plans for our American system of government. So as we finish up this lesson, let's reflect. Democracy is not a new concept. Democracy dates back to ancient Greek and Roman history. The word democracy is not the best term used to describe our government. Our government is what's called a republic. A republic is a system of government based on law. Law in the form of our Constitution. In a pure democracy, majorities would have all the power. Majorities would always win. You would have what's called mob rule. But in America, our Constitution, our Bill of Rights, our amendments can sometimes overrule the will of the majority. That's what makes us a republic and not just a democracy. But in the end, our system only works if you participate. So get out there and vote. Let your voice be heard. And as always, thanks for watching.